It's the Fitness Lab Pittsburgh podcast, a new episode every week. A podcast about movement, part of making your life complete. Fitness Lab Pittsburgh, aka FitLab PGH, brings you interviews with people in the Pittsburgh area who understand movement is part of what makes life complete. Looking for a new movement idea or just want to hear interesting stories about people who make movement a priority? This is the podcast for you. Whether you consider the gym, dojo, or fitness studio your third place, or just want to learn more about movement, activity, and fitness to enhance your life, give FitLab PGH a listen. We interview locals in the Pittsburgh area who make Pittsburgh a great place to move. Subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play, or check out our website for other subscription options. Subscribing is free and gives you notifications when we release new episodes. Each podcast episode will be long enough to pique your interest and short enough to hold your attention. Have an idea for an episode? Know somebody we should interview? Or just want to connect with us? Drop us an email, fitlabpgh@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram at fitlabpgh. Already a fan of FitLab PGH? Check out our sister podcast, Moving to Live. Moving to Live is a podcast for movement professionals and amateur aficionados. Moving to Live offers weekly interviews with movement professionals featuring topics from career development to coaching tips and education resources to advice for parents of student athletes. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you enjoy our next interview, starting now. FitLab PGH and our sister podcast, Moving to Live, firmly believe that movement should be treated as a lifestyle, not just an activity. That's why FitLab PGH, in addition to our once-a-week podcast, releases a video movement tip and lifestyle hack every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on most social media channels. And every Thursday, we do a written FitLab Pittsburgh features. If you like what you hear, leave us some feedback on whatever the app is you listen to podcasts on. Drop us an email with a suggestion for an interview or a FitLab Pittsburgh features. And most importantly, get outside after listening to the next interview and keep on moving. FitLab PGH back with another podcast episode. Just like our sister podcast, Moving to Live, we are a podcast about movement. We believe movement should be treated as a lifestyle. And I have to confess that I am a stickler or somebody who really enjoys outdoor activities. So I try to interview as many outdoor related activity people as possible. And one of my favorite activities is to bike. So I saw an article a couple weeks back about a all-women's bike tour on the Gap Trail. And I did a little social media looking, and I learned that there is a lady who owns a bike touring company. So we are here today with Sara Petyk. She is the owner of Noble Invention Bike Tours. We're going to learn a little bit more about her story and a little bit more about Noble Invention Bike Tours. I think the big catch for this should be, if you are not aware that Pittsburgh is surrounded by rails to trails and bike trails, then you need to become aware of that. And if you're not aware that you can go all the way to Washington, D.C., I'm sure Sarah is going to tell us about that and additional other trails. So Sarah, thanks for taking time to talk to FitLab Pittsburgh.
Hey, thank you so much. And I will take you up on your suggestion to make a very small edit that it's Noble Invention Bike Touring. But everything else you said is absolutely correct.
So now that as I told her at the beginning of the interview, if I mispronounce something, misstate something, correct me, and she has done that. So it's Noble Invention Bike Touring. My first question I always want to ask people that I interview for FitLab Pittsburgh is, are you a Pittsburgh native? And as a follow-up, if so, why are you still here? If not, what brought you here?
I'm definitely a Pittsburgh native, from Franklin Park, grew up in Franklin Park. Actually, I've been here most of my life. I did go away for college and a little bit after college. We came back in the we came back in 2009 specifically because we said, you know what, Pittsburgh is doing some good things. We noticed, amongst other things, that there were more bikers, which you never used to see. And we thought, hey, it might be nice to come back home for a little while and be part of this kind of movement of Pittsburgh into, I guess, what we're kind of seeing now in the city, both from the biking standpoint, but also just from all of the tech businesses and everything that came in. But yes, I am a native Pittsburgher.
And Sara was generous enough to open her house for the interview. And as I walked up, the first thing I saw was they have a nice camper van, which she gave me a tour of. And one of the things she pointed out was there is enough room to have 4 bicycles. So clearly, in addition to running a bike touring business, she is an avid cyclist. So my question kind of is a second one for FitLab Pittsburgh people that I always find interesting is, were you an active kid growing up? If so, what sorts of activities? And was it because mom and dad were active, or was it because mom and dad said, get the heck out of the house and don't come back till dinner time?
Oh, that's a good way of putting it, actually. And it's funny because I never think of myself as an athletic person. And as a kid, no, I was not super into movement, but so I grew up in the 80s, particularly the 80s here. Soccer, everyone did soccer, right? So I was on soccer teams every year. I tried softball. That did not work. And my parents are not particularly active people, but it was definitely the 80s where you were like, there's the woods, go play. And that is absolutely what we did. And I did bike when I was a kid purely to go to my friends' houses, and that was it. So it was that type of active lifestyle. But yeah, I never considered myself athletic. And even now, which I suppose I am somewhat athletic, I don't think that I am.
And that's one of the reasons why I try to say movement should be a lifestyle, not an activity. If you're using a bike for transportation, you're still very, very active, even if you don't think of it. For the person who says, well, all I do is I bike 5 miles each way to work every day, or I walk 3 miles to work each day. Well, you're very, very active, probably more active than the person who says, hey, 3 times a week I go to the gym.
Well, yeah, there is that consistency aspect to it, and assuming that you're able to, even like you say, if it's that 5 miles a day that, it's just how I get into work. If you do that every day, it does kind of become that addiction where when the day that you don't do that, you just feel like something's a little bit off. So instead of having those, long sessions at some trainer or whatever, just saying, I'm just going to do my 45-minute walk every day. That's probably pretty beneficial, I would assume. And I think you do just get accustomed to doing that then.
It becomes the norm. I know there's a gentleman with a dog that I see fairly frequently in Mingo Creek Park. And I've seen this dog for 7 or 8 years with him. And I know I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago, and last year they walked 1,900 miles.
Oh my gosh. Seriously?
And this dog looks no differently than she looked 8 or 9 years ago when she was just a young pup. Oh
no. Do they have like Strava for dog walking?
I did see on my Garmin there is an app that you can get. So I think I don't know if it's for Strava, but I think there's a way that a Garmin watch will read what your dog does also.
Oh my. Oh, that's opening up whole new fields for dog walking. I can see that though.
And my short story on that before we get more into the interview, when I was in grad school, there was a gentleman who was looking at pedometers. This was relatively early, and he used it with children. And I still remember the story. He had this one classroom where there were movement activities from the pedometers that were just far and above what any of the other classrooms were doing. And he looked at it further, and it turns out 4 or 5 of the boys were taking the pedometers and strapping it on the tails of their dogs and watching the tails wag.
Of course they were.
So the data was not necessarily where he wanted it to be, but he quickly learned that for the next session of testing, he had to say, this has to be human movement, not dog movement. So biking, I know one of the things that I did when I was in grad school, simply because it was easier than parking, was to ride my bike. Mm-hmm. You said you left Pittsburgh to go to college. Were you active through college, or did you kind of say, hey, college, I'm going to sit back and do the typical college activities?
Oh, yeah. So I had a break during like junior high school where I didn't do anything active because I wasn't good enough to be on any kind of teams, right? So you're a little kid, everyone gets to join. And then you reach like 7th grade and you actually suck, so you can't join. And then when I got to college, everyone can join again because you've got club teams. And I actually played rugby in college for about 2 years. I enjoyed it very much. It is a lot of fun when you're young to be able to do a controlled contact sport, especially as a woman, because we are not allowed to go out and tackle people. And I do find for people that like that, I definitely recommend if you think you would enjoy it, a controlled contact sport is a welcome outlet. So I did that. By 25, I could no longer do that. My body said, no, that is a no. But I did bike around campus as well. But again, just because I wasn't going to have a car, and I definitely didn't want to pay to park a car. And, and I was most of my years, I was at Cornell, and it's quite a big campus. So to go from where I was living down to like where all my classes were definitely required a beater bike, which is what I had up there.
And for people who haven't been to Ithaca, it's also very hilly.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, it was also up a hill, but yeah, I was from Pittsburgh, so that wasn't a surprise.
So you graduate from college. You've decided after a couple years after college that, okay, my body can't take rugby. We actually interviewed another lady, Waxwing Cycles, who was a rugby player until she had some head injuries. And she said, I got out of that because of that.
Hey, yeah.
And I know when people graduate from college, for me, it was like, wow, now I have enough money where I can actually pay to do all these triathlons I want to do.
That's right.
So some people kind of go a little more with the physical activity. Other people are like, okay, I'm done with this. I got to concentrate on a career, be an adult. Which aspect did you increase your activity, kind of fall in the middle?
Yeah, I definitely went to now I'm out of college and there's no more fun to be had, and let's go do my work, which I actually was an archaeologist, and that's what my degrees were in for, I think, 6 or 7 years is what I did. And that was all I did. I just did my work really. And, I didn't start getting back into any kind of activity until I met my now husband, who has been an active cyclist all his life. And in order to date him, I needed to be on a bike. Otherwise I would never see him. So.
And he was smart enough, I would imagine, not to say, hey, let's do a tandem.
Oh, we have made a firm promise to never get on a tandem together. We will not. Now, there are some folks who are fantastic at tandems. More power to you. No, we will not be on a tandem.
So you get into cycling. Were you the person who was more into, I'm just going to ride around and have fun? Did you go hardcore into the racing? Did you go, we're going to ride across the country?
Yeah, no, I am not hardcore like racer and anything. I think I'm hardcore on like my intellectual and career pursuits. So anything active wise, I try not to go too hardcore into. So I was definitely not that. My husband, Rich, has an amazing nose for hills, and he was also in his 20s and dating me. So that also not a smart combination. So he managed, even though I didn't really want to ride it, to find like every hill we ever could find when we were riding. And he thought that was great. Let's go ride. I have a great route for you. Are there hills? No. Oh, believe me, by hill number 3, I was like, Richard, no. So I wanted to be a recreational, just, beautiful cycle path. Let's just have a good time. But no, I was somewhat forced into a little bit more difficult biking than I wanted to do. But I guess it was good for me.
And clearly it kind of stuck because now you're in a bicycle touring business. And one of the most interesting things for me, for FitLab Pittsburgh, is the stories of how people get to their path of movement or their business. So how do you go from being an archaeologist to saying, I'm going to design and lead and convince people that, getting on your bike and riding for a couple of days, or maybe in some instances, a couple of weeks, and seeing the country, that's what you want to do. Because that's a big change from what I imagine of an archaeologist going on digs and finding old things and the historical precedents of those things.
Well, absolutely. And I think, my interest, in some ways, they are a little bit parallel. As an archaeologist, part of the lure there is that you are outside almost all the time. That's usually what you want to be doing. And that you're interested in other cultures, other places. And as a working archaeologist, I had, good jobs and all of that, but it just wasn't fully satisfying. I didn't feel like I was really serving other people very well. And while we were biking, he's an archaeologist too. We were both archaeologists. And, it occurred to me that it would be nice to be able to have people see some of the places I was able to see and know the history of if they could bike there. The part about teaching people history through biking didn't so much stick. But the part about at least getting people outside and introducing them to travel and different ways of life, different cultures, different histories, I think that's what still drew me to creating the kind of bike tours that I still create and I'm still kind of drawn to. It's that idea of being outside and moving through the world at that pace. Yeah.
So it's not so much we're doing a bike tour and our goal is we're going to do 50 miles a day as fast as we can do it and then just spend the rest of the time sitting in the hotel room recovering.
Yeah, definitely. Exactly. And very much what I do is to those cyclists that don't necessarily want to push themselves at like a training level speed all the time. And I certainly have cyclists that are very comfortable doing century rides and doing long miles, and that go on trips that are maybe 40 or 50 miles a day. And they're fine with that because they know that that's not what they're doing here. They're here to ride a rail trail, to discover that the world that they're moving through. And when you're going at, 18 miles an hour, you're not, even on a bike, you're not really paying that much attention. So we definitely want to focus it to people that are, let's take it back a step. And then we also get a number of people that have never done a bike tour before. And 40 miles would be far beyond anything they could imagine doing in a day. And so 30 miles is their stretch goal. And they take all day to do those 30 miles, and that's fine. So that's, we're definitely in that range of like, yeah, it's not for the hard, or at least it could be for a hardcore person, but we don't create a hardcore atmosphere for it. Yeah.
One of the things that I found with FitLab Pittsburgh and Moving to Live is typically when I interview people and I talk to them about what they like to do, there seems to be a cutoff of somewhere around 35 or so. When the people are older than that, they, rather than saying, my goal is to do a 4-hour and 45-minute century, to my goal is I want to cycle for the rest of my life. And I think what you've described is you do get some of those hardcore cyclists who are saying, hey, I know I'm only going to do 30, 40 miles a day, but those are probably the ones who recognize it's like, yeah, I like racing, or yeah, I like going fast, but boy, what I really like doing is just getting on my bike, and they recognize that, 15 miles an hour or 12 miles an hour on the rails to trails, all of a sudden it's like, look, there's that waterfall that I never noticed when I was on that group ride. Mm-hmm. Or, wow, I never knew there was a microbrewery 2 miles off the trail.
Right, exactly. And also it gives them a chance to, maybe they're riding with a partner that can't ride that much, or maybe they're riding with, a childhood friend that's not the level of cyclist they are, but they want to take this trip with those people that maybe aren't at their level. And, this is a way that they can spend that time outdoors and not kill themselves. And we do have a couple of trips that maybe push the mileage limits, but yeah, we don't do hardcore miles.
I have to ask, as an archaeologist and as a bike tour owner, have you ever thought of a bike tour where you do it on high wheelers or bone crushers?
No, I could not even I have seen those bikes. I'm like, I am not getting up on that bike. I've tried a unicycle. I've seen amazing people on unicycles. I think that's the closest I would come. Yeah, I can't imagine. And you read those stories about the touring that folks would do on those bikes. Like, oh my gosh, I don't understand it.
There's got to be a good story of going from archaeologist to owning a bike tour company. So did you purchase the bike tour company from somebody else? Did you sit down with your husband and say, hey, I've got this really good idea that I think that I want to do that I think you'll appreciate? Or how did it come about?
Well, yeah. So I knew I wasn't completely satisfied with what I was doing in archaeology. And I knew that I wanted to still deal with other cultures. And I did some work at another travel company. But that also, I did not like I was working, 40, 50 hours a week, and the expectation for promotion would have been easily 60 hours a week. And there was no way that I was going to do that. So I actually quit that job just because I knew I could feel it wasn't healthy for me. And I think I was 33 or 34. I wasn't that old relatively. But I was like, yeah, this is not a road I want to go down. And I actually, it was winter. I remember this very well because I would go hiking, hiking is probably a little bit, that's it was not that active. I went strolling through the woods around our house throughout that winter, just to kind of like figure out what is it that I want to do. So being outside in that time was actually really helpful. And then we ended up moving back to Pittsburgh, and so much in life is like timing, right? So that was 2009, 2010. The Gap, Great Allegheny Passage, was completed to Pittsburgh in 2011. Until that connection was made to Pittsburgh, there really wasn't a call for the kind of business that I do. It would have begun in West Newton, which is a great town, but it's a smaller, McKeesport, most people started in West Newton. There wasn't a call for me. There wasn't enough people coming from around the world to ride it because they're like, I don't know the name of that town. That doesn't make any sense to me. Once that connection to Pittsburgh was made, people knew Pittsburgh to DC. That's a trail. That's something I want to do. And we had people coming from, and still do, around the world to do that. And it's a long enough trail that it really, you can try to map out your trip 5 different ways and keep confusing yourself about what you actually want to do and how many miles you should do and where you should stay. So it kind of does require, if you want to just have someone else do the work, it requires someone to do that for you. So I just kind of lucked in on timing wise. I was here and I wanted to do travel, and I was fine with doing biking, and the Gap was almost about to be finished. So it just kind of all came together at the same time and like worked out really, really well.
I'm curious. I've always wanted to ask this question and never known it. Why is the typical path Pittsburgh to DC rather than DC to Pittsburgh?
Well, there's 2 reasons. So one, the trail reason is that technically it's more downhill to go from Pittsburgh to DC. And really it's just the hill between Deal, Pennsylvania and Cumberland. So that's right where the state line goes through. It is about 2.5% grade. It's a minimal grade, but it is a grade. And if you take it from Pittsburgh to DC, you're taking that as a downhill. If you do that from DC to Pittsburgh, you're taking that as an uphill. And additionally, all of the locks on the C&O, if you're going from Pittsburgh, all of those locks are little downs. If you're coming the other way, all of those locks are little ups, right? So I personally think trail-wise, it makes more sense. Logistic-wise, it's also very difficult to have people start in DC. It's such a big town. It's hard for us to get bike rentals there. It's hard for us to meet people there for shuttling at different times. There's just a bunch of logistic reasons. Also that we kind of prefer to have people start in Pittsburgh. I will say too, from a rider standpoint, a lot of people we work with fly in. Pittsburgh is not a really well-known, it doesn't have a lot of one-way trips. So it's also much easier for people to fly into Pittsburgh, but then they get to fly out of DC, and their connections out of DC are so much easier. So, it does make more sense for most people to do Pittsburgh to DC.
Of course, I would imagine from what you described with your husband is when he does it, you make him go from DC to Pittsburgh so he gets the hills.
One of our early dates on the C&O, right around Harper's Ferry, which that section, so now it's still pretty rough, and that section was even rougher back then. And I was on my road bike, maybe 28 millimeter wide. I would guess it was probably more like 24 millimeter wide tires. And he's like, "Oh, this will be great. We're going to go on these side roads. We're going to go down to this towpath. There's this towpath. It's really good. People camp along it. It's fantastic." So I'm on my road bike bouncing along the C&O. And then of course you climb any of the roads, which they're beautiful side roads, but you climb out of anything around there. Cause we're like also, archaeologists, we're like, let's go look at the Civil War battlefield. So yes, he made me go the worst possible place in the worst possible direction on those bikes. So I have done the trail in multiple directions in multiple places. But yeah, my first experience was of course in the worst direction on the worst section on the worst possible bike to be on.
We're talking with Sara Petyk. She is the owner of Noble Invention Bike Touring. She's been talking a little bit about how she got into the bike touring business. And I know from looking at your website and your questionnaire, you do, in addition to tours on the Gap Trail, what other areas people do you design tours for or lead tours? Because I know one of the things for people who like to ride, as you said, the idea of traveling someplace and having to plan out, where am I going to stay? Where do I get my bike put together? Where do I eat? It takes something from what can be a 7 to 14 day vacation. And all of a sudden you've added in an extra 5 or 6 days on either end of planning, plus the things that didn't go on, and you end up maybe not being successful. So where do you lead tours in addition, or where do you design tours in addition to the Gap Trail?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started on the Great Allegheny Passage in the C&O, and then the first place I expanded was the Katy Trail, which runs through central Missouri. It's a gorgeous trail. And in a way, it's very similar to the Gap and the C&O. It's 200 and some miles. So it's a long off-road trail. Gorgeous scenery.
Is it originally rails also?
It is. Yeah, it was a rail banked trail, and it was also part in the 90s, similar to when like the Gap rail banking and work really started in the 90s. It also was around that time. It had a private benefactor that started that. So we expanded there, but again, similarly, and what you mentioned about, where am I going to stay? And did I miss the thing because I was there on the wrong day? And is there food there? The Katy Trail, like the Gap, some of the towns, there's nothing there if you're there on the wrong day. And so that was another reason why we do what we do, because if you're not, you can miss things. You can end up in a town that maybe everything is closed for dinner. And we've certainly heard the horror stories, not our riders, but, from other people that need rescues that call us. So it does actually behoove people, if they can have someone plan it that knows how everything works and where you are going to want to stay. Cause we've ridden it. I don't put anyone on a trail that I haven't ridden. I have been to those towns. I've tried to eat at as many of the places as I can, stayed or at least looked at all the places. So, it's like having, if I wanted to send a friend out on this trail, I would be like, this is where you should go. That's what we do. So we do the Gap and the C&O and the Katy, and those are the 3 base ones. We had offered some tours in Central Florida. If anyone is ever biking in Central Florida. Yeah. Okay. It can be hot at some times of year, but you go down the right time of year, right? And if you're looking at the trail, so the Pinellas Trail, we're really well known outside Tampa Bay. Very popular, right? You're going to get a lot of people on that. What they're doing though is they're going to connect it over to Winter Garden, which is just the North Orlando. That section of Central Florida, honestly, is gorgeous. You get, the palmetto and the ferns and you get the birds. Like, I'm amazed as a Pittsburgher, I go down there and there's birds I've never seen before. I didn't know those things flew around in the wild. Like, that's a flamingo. I didn't know they could do that. So we did initially do this bike trail in Florida. We're not doing it now until they complete the section. But if anyone's down in Florida, take a look at the West Orange Trail, at the Pinellas Trail, at the trails that are going out from like Daytona and Titusville. They're all going to connect eventually. Great trails. We don't offer them now. What I just opened up though was the Virginia Capitol Trail. So it goes Richmond to Williamsburg. And this is very much, like the archaeologist in me, right? Like Williamsburg is my Disneyland. I'm just like, it's always my happy place to go down to Williamsburg. So I've always wanted to do a tour down there, but the Colonial Parkway is not the funnest thing to ride on, especially on a road bike. So they have now completed this Richmond to Williamsburg paved trail. It's only 52 miles, so you could easily do it in one day, but we actually do it in 2 days. The nice thing about it is that there's wineries the whole way. There's like 2 wineries, right? So you get wine tours both days. You stay in these beautiful B&Bs. You end up near Williamsburg. You can go visit Williamsburg. But even if people are down there, I do recommend checking it out because it's actually quite nice. It runs through some of the along where some of the old plantations end. So you go see the old plantation houses, and it's actually more covered than you would think. So you might be like thinking you're going to be in the middle of open Virginia fields in the middle of July. That's a heck no. But actually it's only open for a little portion. and the rest of it is actually quite shaded and very, very nice. And I think that's where the rail trails and like a lot of the trails that maybe isn't fully a rail trail, but the trails that I work on that I'm doing more traveling on, once you're outside of those urban areas, it's always surprising to me, the areas they take you to. It's little pockets of nature that you had no idea were there. And they're just beautiful. We just were riding the Silver Comet Trail, which is outside Atlanta. You think it's going to be hot? Is that the look of, I think it's going to be hot?
You've mentioned, when I lived in Florida, I used to ride the Pinellas Trail.
Okay, so you know the Pinellas.
Suncoast Trail and the Green Swamp Trail.
Yep.
And then I also lived in Atlanta for a while and rode the beginnings of it. No, but even the beginnings, quite nice. Right.
You did not know you were in the middle of Atlanta when you were riding that, right?
No. Well, when I say beginnings, before it was really fully developed. So
what did you remember of it? Like, what did you think of it?
I remember having ridden in Atlanta and lived there for 2.5 years. The fact that, and it was not paved at that point, but it's like you can ride for 2.5 or 3 hours and not get buzzed by a car.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and that's a huge metropolitan area. And just to have a trail like that people can go on to, and you're not going to get buzzed by cars. It's amazing. And so I had never been to that area of Georgia. I had no idea. Is gorgeous. And it connects now at the Alabama line to the Chief Ladaga Trail. Did you go on the Chief Ladaga?
I did not go on the Chief Ladaga.
All right. I had never been to Alabama before. It's beautiful. Had no idea. The Chief Ladaga Trail is maybe 32 miles. So it's really either you live there and you go on it, or like you're visiting, or you're connecting it to the Silver Comet. And it's a seamless connection. It goes right there. But it's just a beautiful area, and it goes through the Talladega Mountains in the first section of it. And we are going back to Alabama just to go to the Talladega Mountains, because we were like, we had no idea. It was so beautiful. And so you find these places that you would have no idea that are like that just by, seeing all these nice bike trails that they're building that are around the country.
And I know some people are listening to this and they're probably divided into two groups. One group is like, I don't want to go and I don't want to exercise on my vacation. And the other group is like, this kind of appeals to me because from what you're describing is you don't have to be a hardcore exerciser because, 30 to 50 miles a day spread out over 7 or 8 hours with a stop for lunch at a good restaurant is very, very doable for people with a moderate level of physical fitness. So somebody's listening to this and I'm sure there's a variety of questions that they want answered before they contact you and say, hey, I want to book it. But do they have to have their own bicycle? Do you have bicycles that you rent to them? And along those same lines, people are going to wonder, how do I train for this? You offer them training suggestions. And for people who are interested, if it's me, I want to know exactly where I'm going to eat because, I want to make sure that the food is up to snuff. When people contact you or when you publish these tours are coming up, you just get thrown in with a bunch of other people, or do they have their own private tour? And I just threw about 9 different questions at you.
Well, most of those are the questions we get every day anyway, so we're pretty used to answering them, but I'll try to get them all. So part of why you would work with so what we do is called self-guided bike touring. Many people are used to hearing about group bike tours or just a bike tour. And that's often where you have a set date. You have a group of people, 12 to, 25. If it's a really big group, I wouldn't want to go with that, but, and they usually have what they call a SAG van. So they have a van coming along with you. A lot of those are road tours, right? So it makes sense you have a van. We're on trails. That van is not driving along next to you. Also, so self-guided means that, you are riding the trail on your own. We're just setting everything up for you. So for food, part of what you're getting from us is that you get maps and a daily itinerary of this is where you're going to go. This is where you should stop for lunch. Like, don't pass up this town. There's nothing else. Stop here for lunch. And then we tell you, which restaurants we recommend. You can always look for yourself, but honestly, there's probably 2 restaurants in most of these towns because they are small towns. So we provide that kind of information, and we tell people in advance, especially if they do have very specific dietary needs, like the Katy Trail, you can do it as a vegetarian. Just be very aware. I know was a vegetarian at the time. It was very difficult. So So we'll tell people that kind of information that they would need to know in advance. They don't have to have a bike, or they could have a bike, but let's say they're flying in and they don't want to fly with their bike. We can set bike rentals up, at any of our tours except the Erie Canal tour right now. And we can also shuttle luggage for people. That also is a nice bonus. So you don't have to carry your own luggage.
And I know a question that people may have is, what type of a bike do they use for this? I would imagine from what you described of your experience with a road bike on the C&O, it's not a $6,000 road racing bike. We
strongly recommend you do not bring a road bike onto the C&O. So we give people those kind of recommendations. And for most of the trails, we do a hybrid bike is what we would recommend. But we'll talk with people through that, and our materials and the website as well, kind of for each trail describes what we recommend. But we do recommend that people be reasonably familiar with cycling. I mean, that they bike once or twice a month. That we can work with. If they've truly not been on a bike for like 5 years, we would say this is probably not where you want to start. Go do something for a weekend and then come back to us. But we can work with people that have never been on a multi-day bike tour before, because as you said, so the mileage you're talking about, 30 miles for a day. If you're looking at probably like a 5 or a 6 hour day, you're talking about 2 to 2.5 hours of riding in the morning, maybe 2 hours of riding in the afternoon. If you have nothing else to do that day and it's spread over that whole time, it's honestly not that bad. We tell people, if they are riding all day, to definitely get off your bike every 45 minutes to an hour. This is mostly if you're not used to cycling. If you have cycled and you're very familiar with your body, you know when you have to get off. But if you're new to bike touring, we tell them about every 45 minutes to an hour, get off your bike, even if it's just for 1 or 2 minutes, because you might find that something's starting to hurt. But for training wise, the biggest thing we tell people is to try riding short miles 2 to 3 days in a row. So I'm not saying that they have to repeat what they're going to do on the tour. They don't need to ride a 30-mile day, but I do want to see them ride 5 to 10 miles 3 days in a row and tell me how they feel on that day 3, because that's really the indicator for bike touring in terms of how you're going to feel and if you feel like you're ready. And if you're training, I'm using air quotes, training for one of our tours, that is what I would recommend to people to do, is to not necessarily say, I've got to ride 50 miles today. No, try to do 10 or 15 miles over Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. That's a training for this type of thing.
We've been talking with Sara Petyk. She is the owner of Noble Invention Bike Touring. I think she's given a really good overview of the idea of having an active vacation where you can have a good time, but not a life-altering experience, which not everybody wants that hardcore, I went to Mount Everest and I survived for their vacation. There's an advantage to staying closer to sea level and really seeing the country or parts of the country on, little pun intended here for the name, the noble invention of the bicycle.
That is correct.
Sara, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to FitLab Pittsburgh and telling us about bike touring and making us realize that this is not something just for a hardcore biker, but just for somebody who wants to see a little bit of the country and who is reasonably active.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and thank you for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of FitLab PGH, brought to you by Moving to Live. Intro and exit music is Marathon Man by Jason Shaw. Check out the show notes for contact info for our latest guests, links to other information mentioned in the episode, and links to our sister podcast, Moving to Live. Moving to Live is a podcast about movement and exercise for professionals and amateur aficionados. Moving to Live offers topics from career development to coaching tips and education resources to advice for parents of student athletes. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Google Play, or check out our website for other subscription options. Your free subscription gets you notified when we release a new episode. Questions, comments, suggestions? Email us at fitlabpgh@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter and Instagram at fitlabpgh and like us on Facebook. If you enjoy our podcasts, Please tell your friends about us and consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. Make FitLab PGH a go-to place to learn more about movement in the Pittsburgh area. Until next time, keep on moving.